The purpose of the dictatorship, as is true of every dictatorship, was to have complete control over the people.
It was obvious fraud, but we had to prove it and speak out.
They wanted to show the world that the people stood behind them.
And the municipal elections were a good example.
That makes 98.85%. The East German communist state built a wall around its citizens, spied on them and lied to them. Then, 25 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. The Lutheran Church played a crucial role in that peaceful revolution. And the 8th commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," was a key demand. Demonstrators took to the streets carrying candles. And sought refuge in churches when the police attacked. Today they're revisiting those churches and the dramatic events of 25 years ago.
We don't have to remind them that every East German citizen has the right to leave the country and return again. What about the Human Rights Convention for us in East Germany?
The Soviet Union had ceased to provide support to the East German state by 1989, leaving it virtually bankrupt. People took to the streets to demand freedom of movement, freedom of speech, transparent elections, the abolition of the secret police, the Stasi. The state kept tabs on everybody. The Stasi had hundreds of thousands of files. Nobody dared to speak out, that is, until 25 years ago. But the protest movement actually began much earlier. In the late 1970s, young people rebelled against their parents and the establishment. It was evidenced by the way they dressed and threw loud music. East Germany's punks were initially inconspicuous, but eventually they found a home in the Lutheran Church. One of the first to welcome them was Pastor Rainer Eppelmann. In a panel discussion, he recalls the time when the East German state kept the nation's young people in line in kindergartens and schools, and even in their free time, through youth groups. The gatherings, attended by punks, were simply ignored. They were considered part of official church services.
We organised a church service that was a mix of blues music and readings from a modern translation of the Bible. The kids loved it and asked if they could come again. We said, of course. So we held another. And 500 people came.
That was a radical break with uniformity in East Germany.
You have to realize that was almost revolutionary. We're talking about a society that was completely different from the one we have today. To the extent that blues and punk music were allowed at all, they had to be songs or tunes composed in communist countries. So only a limited percentage from capitalist countries could be played.
But it was hard to control, and the gatherings took on a life of their own.
The first blues service in the Church of the Redeemer was crowded. There were several hundred or several thousand people outside. We were overwhelmed. We didn't know anything about the blues. It was all very loud. We weren't sure what to do, but it was really fun.
The musical gatherings soon turned into something different, a forum for protest.
As far as I know, the blues service was the first official event in communist East Germany at which everybody said what they were thinking. It was phenomenal.
It wasn't long before environmentalists, artists and civil rights activists also found a home in the church. Here they could openly speak their minds. One of their supporters was the senior Lutheran cleric, Pastor Michael Passauer.
The church's special characteristic is that it's open and public. Its doors are always open. There are no restrictions on who can come in and take part. The church is open because we all belong to it. Not just church members and believing Christians, but anyone and everyone.
But Passauer is also critical of the institutional church in communist East Germany. It may have had its own organisation, but it was integrated into the communist system.
The institutional church would not have taken the initiative. It was environmentalists, peace activists, gays and lesbians who said, "We have nothing more to lose."
These marginalised people stood firm. They had the courage to follow their conscience and confront the state authorities. In the church, they discovered human values and felt accepted. The Lutheran Church had a democratic structure which equipped its pastors to play a vital role after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Everything was done according to democratic principles. We were experienced in democracy. When people were looking for alternatives to the dictatorship of the proletariat in 1989, democratic structures were in demand. And who had them? Not the party, the army, the teachers or demonstrators, but the church. That was our great privilege.
The first priority was to give the protesters room to develop their ideas. The Kirche von unten, or Church from below, was established as an alternative to the communist organisations. One of its members was Thomas Krüger.
I got involved in the Kirche von unten when I was an assistant pastor. I knew all the key figures in the movement and in the grassroots church convention, which it grew out of. They were very political and nonconformist. You could compare them with the anti-establishment movement in the West in the 1970s and 80s.
Michael Heimisch was one of those rebels in communist East Germany, a fierce opponent of conformity, paternalism, lies and deceit. And he made no secret of his views.
We were determined to go out. It wasn't enough to say prayers for each other in church, to sing hymns. It was time to go out into society and say these things on the streets, because the streets belong to the people, not to the state.
But chances to express opposition in communist East Germany were severely restricted. The state organised mass rallies at which it tried to conceal its deception of the people. But rigging municipal elections on May the 7th, 1989, triggered the downfall of the communist regime. Voters who didn't choose a communist candidate were regarded as enemies of the proletariat.
We suspected the elections had been rigged for years. The regime praised itself to the skies, but its amazing support of over 90% bore no relation to reality. And we thought, there are enough of us. We can go to all the polling centers and observe them counting the votes. And we came to the conclusion that the election was rigged.
Rainer Eppelmann also observed the blatant fraud and made it public.
I'd never believed they were saints. I knew they were criminals and dictators, so their audacity didn't surprise me. But of course, I was shocked by their temerity.
We were able to prove that more than 10% had voted no, and a good number had abstained. So when the head of the Electoral Commission, Egon Krenz, announced that the communists had 99.77%, we could prove electoral fraud.
Eppelmann lodged a complaint with the public prosecutor. The reaction was fury.
They said that is outrageous. It's a defamation of the state and its representatives. If you do it again, we'll prosecute you.
But Rainer Eppelmann was not intimidated. Neither were the civil rights campaigners. When the fraud became known, the protests grew. On his old printer, Michael Heimisch produced more flyers. Senior Lutheran clerics supported him, including Pastor Michael Passauer.
Michael Passauer occupied a position between the public sphere and the church. And we younger people, school kids, pastors and friends, responsible citizens we called ourselves, used church premises to meet, but were determined to go out onto the streets.
The Kirche von Unten and civil rights activists raised more issues than just electoral fraud. They were incensed when the East German regime approved the massacre of Chinese protesters on Tiananmen Square. On June 4, 1989, the government in Beijing ordered security forces to open fire on student demonstrators in the Chinese capital.
The East German media reported that the events in China were acceptable because no people were killed, but it was obvious they had been.
It's still unknown exactly how many demonstrators were killed. Estimates range from several hundred to 2,500.
We decided to draw attention to the massacre. We organized a demonstration to hand over a letter. Nothing more. We would gather at the church offices in Pankow and march a few hundred meters to the Chinese embassy. There we would hand over a letter demanding the resignation of the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping.
But Michael Heimisch didn't get that far. Police arrested him and his fellow demonstrators, beat them and threw them into waiting trucks. The state was determined to silence the civil rights campaigners with whatever it took. Michael Heimisch regained consciousness in hospital.
In Berlin, in Dresden and in other cities. In the beginning, they tried to suppress the so-called enemies of the state and counter-revolutionaries with force.
There are documents proving that it was discussed and seriously considered. Troops were put on alert, and the Stasi was mobilized.
In Leipzig, Berlin and many other cities, tens of thousands of soldiers were placed on alert.
On October 7th, the police surrounded this church and prevented anybody from entering or leaving. And the police attacked the demonstrators. It was the national holiday, and in the morning Gorbachev had warned, life punishes those who come too late. It was a very memorable day.
It got pretty dangerous when the police surrounded Gethsemane Church and nobody could get out. That's when we literally put in a wake-up call to the bishop. Gottfried Forck. We called him in the night and asked him to come here and negotiate with them. He was very sympathetic towards the demonstrators. And it was a fine example of what church means. When the bishop got called in the middle of the night, he came here himself and persuaded the police to open a corridor and ease the tension. As a bishop, he had the necessary authority. Even the Stasi had to take a bishop seriously.
Now, resistance to the communist regime had to be taken seriously. Hungary had opened its borders. In Prague, East Germans took refuge in the West German embassy. Foreign Minister Dietrich Genscher negotiated their free passage to the West.
East German politicians like Schabowski and Krenz didn't tear down the wall. It was the thousands of Berliners who marched there that evening and demanded to be let out. The wall fell because more and more people gathered. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened.
When the wall was breached on November the 9th, 1989, it led not only to the reunification of Germany, but to the end of the Cold War. The first free elections in the new Germany were held just over a year later. Berlin's old city hall became the seat of government of the reunited city. Thomas Kruger, an assistant pastor just a few months earlier, became a founding member of the new Social Democratic Party of East Germany and a member of the city government in 1990.
Looking back, people think it all happened in just 2 or 3 days, but it wasn't like that. Things changed bit by bit, sometimes so dramatically that years seemed to pass in a single day, but there were also long processes. I didn't go straight from a demonstration into city government. First, we ventured onto the streets, made our demands, and then began creating new institutions.
After reunification, 2 fundamentally different social systems had to be merged. It was a Herculean task, requiring balance and sensitivity.
City Hall became my second home. Believe it or not, to this day when I come to attend some function here, even though I have a new job, it still feels that way.
Thomas Kruger bumps into the City Hall spokesman. They know each other from the old days and are both aware of the role the church played in the revolution.
The church played a crucial political role at that time, but it quickly returned to its actual religious and social mission. Personal histories vary a lot. Some theologians, pastors, and church workers became politicians. Others chose to concentrate again on their pastoral calling.
Michael Heinisch was one of those who returned to Christian social work, with new ideas to meet new challenges.
After the social upheavals of 1989-1990, I wanted to find my place in the new social system. I took the first set of laws I came across, laws for the protection of children and minors. Then I began reading and thought, wow, this contains everything we always wanted to do.
He decided to help marginalised young people cut through the red tape of the new system.
When I became the Senator for Youth and Family Affairs in City Government in the early 1990s, who turned up? Michael Heinisch, with his inclusive approach translated into Christian social work. He formulated it differently, but it was the same work he had done as a deacon.
In city flashpoints, Heinisch created alternatives for young people struggling with the new system.
Michael Heinisch hat in Lichtenberg,
a district that's full of flashpoints, Michael Heinisch has done a lot of very solid work, helping to resolve conflicts. He has done so much with young people, helping them to lead an independent and responsible life in our society.
Verantwortliches Leben in unserer Gesellschaft führen zu können.
He offers them job training and teaches social skills. Heinisch has successfully acquired millions of euros in state subsidies for his foundation. And numerous youth clubs and training centres have sprung up in the Lichtenberg district of Berlin, all thanks to this Lutheran deacon. In a carpentry shop, for instance, kids are taught skills that give them perspective. As trained carpenters, they'll have a good chance of finding work and reintegrating into society. Teachers, parents and social workers had all but given up on these kids. They were trapped in a cycle of drugs and violence. But with Michael Heinisch, everybody is given a chance.
The kids and families I meet tell me about their problems, and those problems are usually related to social structures. So I do something to change the social structures. I go to the politicians and tell them about the lives of the kids and families I meet.
Out of the wreckage of the East German state, a battlefield of anarchist squatters, neo-Nazis and police, Heinisch has helped create a peaceful and socially aware environment. It includes a restaurant with a food service training program. The project is thriving. Even locals can hardly remember how run down the district used to be.
Hat es Ihnen denn geschmeckt? Haben Sie sonst noch einen Wunsch? Zusammen oder getrennt? Machen wir gern.
It was here on Alexanderplatz that courageous East Berliners began their march to Gethsemane Church 25 years ago. The demonstrators back then were as peaceful as the marchers today, many of whom were born after 1989. The older generation who took part in that historic march tell them that non-violence was their strongest weapon.
If just a single group had resorted to violence, thrown stones, everything would have turned out differently. That's not to be underestimated. The biblical message, "Blessed are the peacemakers," came alive and was tangible at that time.
There's police presence at this march of remembrance, but only to direct the traffic. 25 years ago, it was a different story.
In the autumn of 1989, the Gethsemane Church became a symbol of opposition because a lot of the demonstrators lived in this part of town. But there were many churches that became places of refuge, places to meet, and centers of protest. The people who wanted to leave East Germany met in churches, and the opposition groups turned to the church for sanctuary.
Many of them jumped from the sanctuary into the shark-infested waters of politics. In 1990, there were more pastors in Parliament than ever before.
Society needed trustworthy people, people you couldn't accuse of doing it for money or prestige. They did it out of conviction. They wanted truth, justice, and freedom to return to the world.
Die Demonstration ist damit beendet. Wir wünschen der Polizei einen guten Heimweg und einen schönen Feierabend.